So, we all need a reinvention sometime. It's important to give things a new direction to keep things fresh and interesting. And there's a certain special decade that I think we had kind of an overabundance of this. And of course, I'm talking about the 90s. Now, naturally, the first thing that comes to mind when you think of 90s redesigns is the super edgy and try-hard looks that permeated the decade. Just about every long-standing character got some sort of redesign in this era, for better or worse. But a lot of these tend to fall flat and just totally miss the point of the character in the first place. But you know, for the vast majority of these failed designs, I think there's a few that really stand out and happen to deliver some amazing stories that go along with it. A lot of these redesigns were forced through by editorial mandate to try and keep up with the sales of the fledgling comic book era at the time. You see, a lot of your traditional superhero costumes and themes were kind of foregone to the brand new grimdark, super serious, edgy, realistic themes and trends. See, a lot of the interest that comes from that is spun off of huge successes of the 80s like Watchmen and The Dark Knight Returns. You know, stories like that really hit a vibe that a lot of people were gravitating to at this time. And because of the mistreatment from Marvel and DC to their artists, a lot of them ended up leaving and forming their own companies like Image and Dark Horse, and ended up taking their new dark themed ideas with them. And so in an effort to follow that trend, we would often see classic superheroes take on the very baseline, shallow interpretation of what they thought people liked at the time. And sometimes the people making those dark stories fell into the same traps themselves. And so obviously this leads to a lot of ridiculous looks. You know, you've seen all the lists and everything, the top 10 worst 90s costume redesigns kind of things. And don't get me wrong, I love making fun of these too. They deserve to be made fun of. But for all of those, there's still some that manage to be great redesigns and also even kind of comment on the direction of comics at the time and pump out pretty good stories that are remembered to this day. And so I'm here to list off a couple that I like and why I like them. Okay, so first on this list, I'll admit this is not one I've read myself, but I've seen him make lots of worst redesigns of the 90s, and I feel like this one's a little bit unjust, so I'm putting him here to redeem him a little bit, and that's Daredevil in his armored look. I'm not real sure if it has a name to it or anything, but it's just sort of a redesign that they gave him for like a few issues, not really too long of a run. We haven't seen it too many times since, but this is one of those that doesn't probably make too much practical sense. You know, he's an acrobat, he's leaping from rooftops in New York, so yeah, let's strap some metal to his chest. But I really don't care. I still think it's cool. The color scheme, I think, kind of works for me, even though it's like this weird kind of dark red and blue. And they moved his Daredevil emblem up to like his top pectoral kind of chest area. I don't know, it's a pretty solid design in my opinion. And Daredevil's not really the one to get too many redesigns. I mean, this is his first redesign since his 7th issue back in like, whatever year that was. And still to this day, he's had maybe only 1 or 2 others that I can think of, and I think this isn't a bad one. And so next is Aquaman. Talk about a total overhaul in design, you know, like long hair, full beard, hook hand. You know, if you like the Jason Momoa Aquaman, this is the exact iteration of this character that you need to be thinking. And you know, these days the whole Aquaman is a joke stigma is kind of wearing off a little bit, but this design was thought up by writer Peter David, who had a 75-issue run on this version of Aquaman and brought a whole lot of changes to him that we still see referenced and reused to this day. See, at the time Aquaman was really in a slump. They had no real directions for him. He just came off of being in a version of the Justice League that was canceled, so it being the 90s, they tasked him with giving Aquaman a darker edge for the time. And not only did he do that with depressing storylines and hardships that he gave him, but he also expanded his universe, kind of gave him a new mythos and more characters to draw from. But getting to the actual redesign, there's a few iterations of it. Firstly, like I said, he grows out all of his hair. He gets one of his hands eaten off by piranhas forcibly, and then he replaces his hand with a hook hand, and then he gets a magic hand, all while being shirtless, keeping the green pants. He gets a armored shoulder kind of thing. I don't know, practical, maybe not, but I can't help it. I just like weird pieces of armor hanging off of people. But yeah, solid story, solid redesign. If you haven't read it, I'd totally recommend it. Even if you think you don't really like Aquaman, aren't interested in him at all, this is one of the things I think could change people's minds on that. Superman. Yeah, Supes is one of those characters that had an absolute stock of different redesigns, stories they tried. They even gave him different powers sometimes. He had replacements almost come in after his death. But you know, the one suit I really have to go with, and I think is undeniable, is the black leotard, silver embossings. And this is the suit he gets after coming back from dying at the hands of Doomsday. And even though his resurrection was always planned from the start, the way that they carried out his death through like the media and everything, they made it a pretty big deal. So, you know, they had never killed off any character at this level, at this kind of capacity, to actually do away with them for about a year or two's worth of stories. And you know, one common thing that a lot of these redesigns have is adding stuff to the character, and this is one where we see them actually taking away things. So he doesn't have the cape, and he doesn't even have his powers when he first comes back. The death and rebirth of Superman is a great storyline. I'd recommend it to anyone. Again, if you think you don't like the character, this is one of the stories that actually kind of makes them more likable. You know, they're not this uber powerful character that never has any problems. You know, he literally dies in this storyline, even though he comes back. It's still a great story to read, and you know, I've read it several times myself. It's just lots of fun. Let's see, next, Spider-Man. Yeah. Oh yeah, the 90s was a crazy time for Spidey. Like symbiotes, clones, and I can pretty safely say he has the largest assortment of costumes out of anyone on this list. That leaves a lot to pick from, but I think my answer is pretty easy and a predictable one. It's the Scarlet Spider suit. The one that his clone, Ben Reilly, wears. Now, the Clone Saga is huge and complex, and I could spend all day talking about it. So that's why I'm going to barely touch on it here. Only mentioning that Ben is Peter's clone, and he was set to take Peter's place as the actual Spider-Man for the entire future. Like, he was supposed to be the replacement, and Peter was supposed to have his happily ever after with Mary Jane, because they had kind of run the course on his story. They had a hard time telling stories about a married person. Mary Jane's role took a second place position. In a lot of the stories of the time, they just had to keep cutting back to her being home, worried about Peter while he's out Spider-Manning. So instead of trying to figure out how to write her more interestingly, they just decided to try and replace it, which editors at the time thought no one would go for. And it's pretty likely that they wouldn't have. I mean, Peter is Spider-Man, you know. It's just kind of sad to think that like a character that you've been following for decades is now not really going to be in the picture anymore and is replaced with this new, younger kind of character. That character being Ben Reilly. So when Ben comes back, he takes on a version of the Spider-Man suit being a solid red spandex full body suit with a ripped up hoodie with a hastily drawn spider on it. And there's just something so less but more about it. And keeping with the times, he was usually drawn with a lot of different pouches. Pouches were definitely the thing at the time. I mean, this is the decade of the fanny pack, you know what I'm saying? And another interesting thing they did with this was that they gave him exposed web shooters on his wrists. I just love seeing the functionality of a suit kind of explained visually. You know, like you kind of see what's going on. You know, you see what the character prioritizes and keeps on them at the ready. I think it's just some really cool insight that draws you into the character more. And you know, personally, I credit the Scarlet Spider with this explosion in the Spider-Verse that we get to see now. Like, there's all these alternate versions of Spider-Man from different universes. I think this was kind of the prototype of that. Even though it's taking place in the same universe, it's an alternate version of the same character interacting with the main one that we know. So while like the entire story of the Clone Saga doesn't hold up as well, there's definitely some memorable Ben Reilly moments, like when he actually does take over for Peter and gets his own official Spider-Man suit. But I still think the first one is the one that really resonates with me and a lot of other people because, you know, any Spider-Man video game you play these days, if it doesn't have the Scarlet Spider suit, that's a crime. That's literally a point I take off if I'm playing a Spider-Man game because I have to have that suit. It's almost as iconic as the black Spider-Man suit. You know, it's just a really beloved suit. And I think I could literally spend like 12 hours talking about it, so I'll just cut it right here. So now we've reached the end of the list, and this was really a toss-up between Spider-Man and who I have for this place, and that would be Batman. So like I said at the beginning of this video, a big thing for the decade was deconstructing characters, reinventing them, kind of tearing them down to the essentials and really pushing them further than we've seen before. And in the storyline Nightfall, we see exactly that. And, you know, some of those famous graphic novels like Dark Knight Returns, it's fun to see that kind of dark iterations for characters, but it's really hard to fit that into a never-ending narrative when you've always got to return back to square one at the end of the day. But every once in a while they manage to go with a storyline that does go that far and is able to reset after it's all said and done. And in the 93 to 94 storyline Nightfall, we see Batman pushed to his absolute edge. I mean, he's fighting every villain he's got at the beginning of the storyline, all because of the introduction of a new character, Bane. And Bane was an instant classic villain himself. He immediately was iconic, and we even saw him in the criminally underrated Batman and Robin that came out just a few years later. And in this storyline, after Batman is just completely broken by Bane himself, a character that they have been building upon ends up taking his place, and that would be Jean-Paul Valley. His vigilante name before this was Azrael, so that's kind of incorporated into his new Batman look. See, he ends up using armor that Bruce wasn't fully able to utilize to immediately go out into the streets and just beat the absolute shit out of every single villain that was causing problems, and he did this a bit too effectively. See, this was a much more brutal take on the traditional Batman that we know, and it's reflected in the costume that we get. So to actually get to describing the costume, the first thing that comes to mind is knives. Yeah, he's got pretty much knives all over him. He's got knives on his hands, the little fins that Batman has on his wrists, those are knives now too. Knives on the legs. His cape looks like it's made of knives. And the mask is really sinister looking. Usually we see Bruce's exposed face, and this kind of gives him a little bit more humanity. Yeah, that's completely covered up in this. You know, he looks almost robotic, which kind of plays into the brainwashing that he had grown up in, which is also why he struggles to even hold the mantle, because he's so brainwashingly violent. The colors are kind of a dark turn on the traditional Batman colors, which are already dark. So, you know, instead of the blue that you would used to see, so it's like a navy blue, and of course they keep the black. You know, you don't get much blacker than black. And you know he's got all the pouches, you know, on his leg, his wrist. You know, the suit is fully armored. And you know, part of what makes this not just a good design but a good story is that it comments on the whole direction of comic books at the time. You know, like, should we retire these old heroes? Are they really just broken and worthless, and this new violent edge is the future and way more effective? You know, it's a struggle not just between the heroes and the villains, but in how the heroes should conduct themselves. And you know, as the story goes on, the suit gets more updates. It gets like a third targeting eye, which kind of just looks like a zit to me. You know, the other designs are just fine, but the first one really holds up to me. But the constant building that they do on the suit further leans to that narrative that they're going for. So yeah, this one really has it all. Like an interesting story that's surprisingly kind of deep. It stands out. I think it's a unique place in this character's history. And oh yeah, also it's just a really cool suit, and I like it, so I'm talking about it. Well, those are my favorite redesigns of the 90s. You know, so maybe the next time you see like a list that's all about the negative aspects of the decade, maybe you'll think of one of these or a few that you liked or grew up with or vaguely remember. But yeah, let me know what those are, and thanks for watching. I'm guess gonna go read some more comics now.